going to look at a story from the Second World War's North African operation today. It's June 1942 when the story starts. At the age of 24, Flight Sergeant Denis Copping was a volunteer pilot in the Royal Air Force with the 260th Squadron. They flew Curtiss P-40 Kittyhawks. From Al-Wadi al-Shahid in northern Egypt, Copping was to take on one of the P-40s, serial number ET574, on a ferry flight to a nearby British airbase so that the undercarriage could be fixed so it would no longer lower. This was done in order to get all the available planes ready for the upcoming summer assault. After that, on June 28th, he would take off with the undercarriage dropped at head west. Denis Copping would not be seen again. According to one source, a fellow pilot at the 260 Squadron saw that Copping was flying off in the wrong direction and tried to get his attention. However, the other pilots were unable to do so, and the plane and the pilots were reportedly lost after several hours. Where the planes and pilots were, on the other hand, would stay a mystery for 70 years. It's not clear if anyone actually tried to find Copping after he went missing. It is famously hard to do search and rescue missions in the Sahara. The rough landscape would have made it very hard for a rescue plane to land, and there would not have been any landmarks to help people on the ground find a place that they had seen from the air. After a long time, in April 2012, workers from the Polish oil company found the surprisingly well-preserved remains of a P-40. The very dry conditions had preserved the planes that had almost no rust or rot. The wings were half buried in the sand and in good shape, even though they'd been sandblasted by decades of hot wind and sand. The fabric covering on the control surfaces had long since rotted away, but the cockpit was mostly still there and looked like it hadn't been touched since the day it crashed. The plane looked like it had been frozen in time, with live ammo still in the fighter's 6 machine guns. The plane was in such great shape that it was easy to identify. It was quickly linked to Copping, who'd been reported missing 69 years, 9 months, and 14 days before. But there were no signs of human bodies at the crash site, which could only mean one thing: Copping lived through the crash landing. What happened to him was now the big question. In any case, taking into account where Copping's P-40 ended up, it was clear that a navigational mistake had been made at some point during the flight. The plane would run out of fuel almost 300 kilometers from the nearest populated area and 370 kilometers southwest of Cairo. According to the propeller found in the desert, Copping may have decided to land before he ran out of fuel fully. This is because it was bent in a way that fits with rough landings that were done with power. It's hard to be sure though, and the P-40 may have landed on its wheels. Even though the landing tore off the propeller and the gearing unit from inside the engine, the emergency landing went well. This was quite an accomplishment, since Copping had to land with the landing gear extended and in soft desert ground, where there was a big chance that his plane would dig in and nose over. The unfortunate airman lived through the impact, but his P-40 did not flip over. He then found himself in the middle of the desert. Copping was now lost and alone in the middle of the world's biggest desert. It might have been better if the landing had killed him right away, and RAF planes at the time would only take a small amount of food and water, enough for 1 or 2 days at most. He was a lot farther away from civilization than that. An investigation of the crash site showed a small makeshift camp next to the plane, which had been constructed using the silk from Copping's parachute. The plane's battery and radio were also found there, which suggests that Copping had tried to send out a call for help. It was sad to find out that the radio's internal workings had been destroyed during the landing. This must have been discouraging for the co-pilots who'd worked so hard in such extreme heat for nothing. Around this time, Copping chose to leave his camp and try to find salvation. This is where the trail pretty much ends to this day. Soon after the wreck was found, a big step forward was made when a group of Italian researchers found human bones just 5 kilometers from the crash site. On the other hand, it seems these were not belonging to Copping after a short study. Family members of Copping's who are still alive have had disagreements with different officials in Egypt and the UK about the bodies. It looks like they were said to be too old to be the lost pilots, but no DNA test was ever done. The case is still ongoing, and several forensic experts want to go and try to get the DNA themselves. Along with the bones, a piece of the parachute, a key fob, a belt stamped with the year 1939 were found. This is pretty strong proof that these are in fact the remains of the British pilots, and the dates were wrong. The mystery isn't over yet though, because there is flak damage all over the aircraft. Some people think that the cop may have been shot down. The more likely explanation is that this was fight damage that was part of the reason the plane was being ferried for repairs. Even so, it doesn't make sense that they weren't patched over before the trip. That would have been normal. There's already a lot of doubt about the plane, and this adds to it. the mystery has never been fully answered. Following 25,490 days spent in the Saharan sky, Copping's P-40 was taken to the El Alamein and stored there. It was later fixed up and put on show outside the War Museum. The Royal Air Force Museum at Hendon wanted to make a trade deal, but talks with Egyptian officials broke down in the end. Unfortunately, ET-574 now has a camouflage pattern that doesn't match its historical background, and it's thought to have been restored not very well. However, it was saved from being thrown away, and one day it might be the subject of a more historically correct and thorough restoration program. A lot of people want this to happen because the plane is very important, both because of its history and because it's the only remaining Desert Air Force P-4 Kittyhawk. There were more than 3,000 of these planes made. If luck had been better and the radio hadn't broken down when they landed, this story might have turned out very differently. At this point, all we can do is guess that Copping died of exposure somewhere in the Sahara after walking for a while. He is still there to this day. At that time of year, the desert would have been about 35 degrees Celsius, and the nearest settlement would have been 300 kilometers away. Such a journey would have been nearly impossible, with no chance of survival. Copping couldn't have known this at the time, or if he had, he couldn't have done anything about it. Anyhow, today you can pay your respects to Denis Copping and the many other soldiers who died in North Africa at the El Alamein Memorial in Egypt. Thanks for watching as always. Comment with your honest thoughts on the show, any changes you think I could make, and what topic or aircraft you want to see next.